In anticipation of our open house this evening and wrapping up today, we have an opportunity to hear from Dr. Nick Mueller, Steve Vogel, Preserving the Legacy, Creating the National World War II Museum. A couple things before we dive too far into it. One, I do want to give a shout out. Our team is, Robert mentioned Adam Givens. He had been our POWMI Accounting Agency Fellow here at the museum. We do research to help bring home or closure to the 72,000 Americans still missing in action from World War II. And so that mission continues. But to this piece, kudos to Nick as the founder, president, CEO, Emeritus. Opportunity to tell the remarkable story about the founding of the National World War II Museum. We're in for a real tour de force with that. But joining Nick on stage, many of you don't know, is Steve Vogel. He's the principal editor of Nick's book. As you can imagine, Nick's book was probably 7 times longer than it originally was supposed to be.
At least.
But no one better than Steve, veteran journalist, Washington Post reporter for 2 decades, really has a sterling reputation for his coverage of military affairs, overseas conflicts, treatments of veterans. My hat's off to both of these gentlemen. Steve's previous books, Betrayal in Berlin, is a story of the Cold War espionage, but Perilous Fight about War of 1812, The Pentagon, A History, which is a page-turner for us who've served in the Pentagon, probably to no one else. And then just recently, tied to our last panel, a task force called Faith, the untold story of the U.S. Army soldiers who fought for survival in the Chosin Reservoir and honor back home. And so, tied, many of the themes that Robert just talked about. But so Nick, I know you want to start the session, and then after that we'll turn it over to Steve. But Preserving the Legacy, Dr. Nick Mueller and Steve Vogel.
I just wanted to thank Steve Vogel for cutting out those 400 pages. That a lot of that, though, that's left on the cutting room floor ends up being of value to the National World War II Museum, because nobody else is ever going to write it, I don't think. And I'd also like to thank Taylor Doherty and Jason Vann and Marissa Primo in my office before I retired, who did a tremendous amount of work. So, having said those thank yous, Steve, it's all yours.
All right. Well, Nick, I was glad one thing we left in the book was the story of how this crazy idea for the museum came together, and that, as you write, started with your traditional glass of sherry in the backyard some 35 years ago. And I was just wondering, I didn't ask this directly at the time, but were you guys crazy? How much sherry did you drink?
I guess it looks like quite a lot. So 34 years later, here we are. So, but it was a small idea at the time, and some of you, many of you probably know the story. But in any event, we were best friends, and we got together 2 or 3 times a week after I was in administration then. And so we get together, drinks at my house or his house, and scheme our next project. And there were a lot of them we had done before, and we trusted each other, and we enjoyed those afternoons. And whether it was a camping trip or a sailing trip or buying a sailboat or starting his D-Day to the Rhine tours, we cooked up a lot of things together, and that's what good friends do. But he said to me, he said, "Down, Nick, this was serious." I mean, he said, "You just now taken over the head of this research and technology park. It had nothing but land on the right there. You can see it on the Lake Pontchartrain across from the UNO campus. Those were the beaches that Higgins tested the landing craft, and Eisenhower, he said to me, one point back in the 60s, said that Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us because he built those boats and got us over open beaches, and not just D-Day, but the Mediterranean, the Pacific, and the man who won the war. Steve never forgot that, and he thought that this man needed to be honored in the city that he built those some 12,000 landing craft, another 8,000 others. He was an inventor and an entrepreneur and just a kind of a Wild Bill pirate too, but a colorful figure. And he says, and I've got 600 oral histories of the guys on D-Day, and I finished recording them, and they're all transcribed, and I'm still doing some more, but they're from my book coming out in '94 for the 50th anniversary. And he said, we're going to open a museum in your research park because it's got to have some research relationship, and my oral histories are that. My book will be out. It'll be a bestseller. And he said, it's just going to be an easy thing to do. I need you. You want to do this? And I said, man, it's the best idea I ever heard. He said, good. That's good. We're going to do it. It's going to only cost $1 million. I said, Steve, you're so naive about those things. It's going to be at least $4 million. Come on. And, oh, God, he said, we could never raise that much money. But it was just going to be in that small little research park out by the lakefront by UNO. And he wanted to take care of those oral histories and wanted a museum to support and ensure that the revenues would be always there because UNO was always in financial difficulties and he wanted to preserve them. So we were a little bit cocky, I would say, and a little bit out over our skis because neither one of us knew a damn thing about building a museum. So, but anyhow, it didn't seem like, it seemed $4 million was doable. And then he said, well, okay, you go out and raise the money. I said, no, see, we're going to do this together. You know, you're the big star. And so everybody knows you, Brokaw, you meet with presidents, they have you speak in Congress all the time, you're everywhere, national star, America's historian. I said, so, okay. So he says, I'll do it. But then he said, we got to figure out how to do it. And I said, that's right. So we invited in the presidential directors of about 5 presidential libraries, including the Eisenhower Center and a few others. And they said, this is a great idea, but you're never going to get anywhere unless you get some federal money. So Steve runs up to Congress and asks our legislator, who is Representative Bob Livingston, who's just was on the screen a moment ago. And because we both knew that bar dreams are just hallucinations unless you have money or resources to execute them. So he told Bob that story. And Bob said the same thing I did, best idea you ever had. He says, I never hear ideas that good come into this office. So how much do you need? Well, Steve wasn't ready for that one, but he blurted out, $4 million. He calls me up, he says, we got it. And I said, how much? He said, $4 million, all we need. I said, where'd you get that number? He said, from you. I said, see, that wasn't a feasibility study. That was over too much sherry. But anyway, that was a moment of creation, though, is either his backyard or mine and too much to drink. So,
okay, so you got Steve, of course, has this national reputation. You know, Mr. D-Day, he's going to be known as that. What did you bring to the table? You're a historian, but what was Steve looking to you to provide?
Well, first of all, it was a team. I mean, we trusted each other. We had a lot of confidence in each other, as friends do. He was my best friend for the last 10 years. And I had started, you know, we both, like you see a picture of the UNO summer school I started in Europe. Boy, he liked to get students out on the field of the Civil War battlefields. I was a European historian, and to get my students out on the fields and into Europe, I had to create a summer school of 200 students to go over to Innsbruck, Austria for a 6-week summer school with 20 faculty members and make money on it. For the university, said they didn't give me a dime. They said, if you can figure it out, you can do it. And so we both were into creating historical experiences and adventures in learning. That's one of the things that bound us together. So we just always were eating the leaves off of each other's trees. And I was kind of getting known because of that summer school, which is now, if you can believe it and know how old I am, it's now next summer is the 50th anniversary and there's over 12,000 students. So I was sort of the designated startup guy at the University of New Orleans, as the only faculty member could figure out how to make any money on a new program or project without any money to start with. And so Steve needed that, and I had some staff, and he had some staff in the Eisenhower Center. And he got the $4 million, and we, getting ahead maybe of your questions, but we created a nonprofit 501c3 board because the money from Congress, they didn't want it to go to the university. They wanted an independent board. So that was a shift. I mean, so it wasn't, Steve and I were still employed. We were on the board, but it was not, the board now business leaders, about 23 of them, were kind of running things. So anyhow, we were just a good team. And of course, he was the founder, the creator of the visionary who came up with the idea. And sometimes it was my idea, and he was on the other side of it. But anyhow, we just did a lot of things together, and that's how it started.
Partners in crime, so to speak.
Yeah.
You know, this book is really not just an institutional history. I think it's a lot more than that. It's not a case study. How would you describe it?
Well, several ways. I mean, the simple way to think of 34 years of trying to tell the story about what happened during those years is why we did it, how we did it, which is sort of raising money and mobilizing. I mean, I was sort of the organizer and communications guy to donors and board members and so forth. But that's sort of the how part. What we did has to do with choices about what we remember and what we choose to forget, at least forget as far as our permanent exhibits are concerned. And then the meaning of it all. So you have to, at the end, our exhibit designers later on, 10 years later, when we started the World War II Museum, transformed into that, said, what the hell does it all mean to somebody a century from now that you guys built a little museum down here? So the meaning of this museum and why telling that story about World War II is so important to us. And we had to answer that question to every donor and every government leader that we asked money for. It's also my story. So it's sort of a memoir history, I would say. And you know, it's the biography. It would start off as a D-Day, the National D-Day Museum. That's the biography of a single day. Arguably the pivot point of World War II, certainly in Europe. I mean, that had power. And I sensed that even through that few drinks of sherry. Steve, just like your book, this is a powerful idea. But we had to surround it with other elements of the war. And, you know, Steve was the American historian, Midwestern. I had family roots, went back to Germany. My parents were immigrants in 23, 24. My dad was a rabid anti-Hitler. He'd read Mein Kampf. We had European roots. I was over there at the age of 14. I was walking in the ruins of Hamburg, which hadn't changed much since 1945. And so we had different perspectives, and I brought more of the longer perspective, some 5,000 years of history, going back to the beginnings of the Greek city-states and the epic war that Herodotus, the father of history, tells us about the mighty Persian Empire, the barbarians, the evildoers who were coming to crush these small democracies. It's a David and Goliath story, and it's just fantastic metaphor, and I said that, Steve, our guy's going into those cliffs of Normandy, and it's that same kind of epic story. So, but it also has a fountainhead in our own history and our American Revolution, and we're now approaching 250 years. So we may come back to that later on, but so that's, in a nutshell, what I was trying to achieve. Tell the why, the how, the what, and the meaning with that overlay of my own memory of the ups and downs during the course of those 34 years. And I can honestly tell you, I had no idea I was going to be having any leadership role running this museum for the first 8 years. So that is another story.
Indeed. So you have these lofty ideas and goals. You're expecting, the plan is you're going to have this little museum open by D-Day 1994. You didn't quite make that, did you?
We weren't even close. We knew by 1992 we weren't.
You were broke, right?
We just had free land, and we could spend them federal money on consultants and architects, and but the board decided. It's again, we weren't the decision makers. The board decided they didn't want to hire any staff. They were relying on some of my staff and some of Steve's staff. But we were not very good at raising money, and so we hadn't raised much at all by 1992. So he said, in '94 we'd planned, okay, let's just have a big reenactment on Lake Pontchartrain on those beaches. And we're all going to Normandy because Steve's book was going to be out then, and we produced a film. Charlie Guggenheim, one of the great documentarians, had won numerous Academy Awards, and he was going to create the film that was going to be in our exhibit. So it's an exhibit film. And that would be done by May of '94. So we were going to have a premiere of that. And then we were going to go all off to Normandy for the 50th anniversary of Normandy. Charter a ship from London to Caen, to Normandy. And so that anniversary was sort of our point to the future. That we were going to get 500, and we did get on that ship. It was an amazing time, but with no money, we had to do something to keep the momentum going, and that was it.
So that experience at Normandy in '94, I mean, that turned out to be a lot more than just a cruise. I mean, it was you were pretty moved, and I guess saw this goal is taking on a whole new meaning based on what you experienced over there. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, for me, I was Steve's pal. We were going to do this museum. I thought it was important, very important. But being at the Normandy Cemetery on that day, Steve Ambrose was under contract to NBC with Tom Brokaw and Katie Kirk, and all day long I was standing there. There must have been 10,000 World War II, mostly D-Day veterans, pouring by us. And it was just, I said, this is daunting responsibility now. This little museum in the research park at that time. And I said, man, talk about what Robert Edsel is and what we are charged with trying to remember and preserve this story. So I write about that there because it had such a profound influence on me. And Steve, of course, felt the same way. And he was talking about the museum all day. Every time Brokaw would give him a chance, he said, we're trying to do this little D-Day museum down in New Orleans. He didn't say little, but in any event, Steve was front and center there, and it was just a powerful, powerful day. And we had David Montgomery. We had, I think John Eisenhower was on that tour, the Sons. I mean, it was very meaningful to me. But we thought, this was the first of many times, we thought that, boy, we are there now. We are going to go back, and people are just going to start throwing money at us, and it's going to get that museum built. But just like a lot of the other times, it was just sort of like a Roman candle. I mean, after about 4 or 5 months, no more talk about it. We were back in the trenches trying to find ways to raise private money. We always had more success with federal government and then a little while later with the state. But that was another big disappointment. And we were just kind of in this lull for a couple years.
Yeah, so you basically come back down to earth. When
Yeah,
you're
literally.
Back, literally, and
Yeah.
you find yourself in a pretty bitter struggle over exactly where this museum is going to be built. I mean, you and Steve thought, well, naturally we're going to build it out at the UNO at the lakefront property, but not everybody saw it that way. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we even did the master plan you're looking at there, and if you're looking at the far left side, you can see the D-Day Museum was penciled in there in the architectural plan. The board was bitterly divided, and Steve says later in the newspaper, some years later, I lost a lot of friends over this, but half the board wanted us to be downtown because that's where the tourists were. What Steve wanted and the chancellor wanted, my boss and my best friend, I was head of the research park, supposed to get buildings into the park that are museum and research related. But the board, half the board, these are top business leaders. They said, we're not going to succeed out here. We're 5 miles from downtown. We need to be right in the heart of the tourist area. Well, we had a consultant that came in 92 or 3. And so I saw the handwriting on the wall. She said, you've got to decide whether or not you are a research center that happens to have a museum. And that's fine. You can raise a lot of money for that, education, grants. Or you're going to be a museum that happens to have an Eisenhower Center, a research center, in which case, however you decide that will determine the location. Well, I knew when she said that we were going to end up downtown sooner or later because this museum wasn't going to receive any university support for operations. It had to sustain itself. And so that ended in 1995 when we found an old warehouse downtown. Somebody on the board did, and it coincided. It was a perfect storm in a way, a change that changed our history and our trajectory because somebody discovered, looking at the fine print in the government grant, at $4 million, that we had $1 million left. We could only spend it on capital projects, and it was going to be gone back to Washington, D.C. if we didn't spend it by 1997 on something. Well, we spent the last $1 million to buy that warehouse that you're looking at here. And that thing on the side is a loading dock. It was a freight forwarding warehouse. And 4 years later, I was told that that's where we're going to have the opening. Oh my God, we're going to open up in a loading dock. I said, that's our grand entrance. So that's another story. But for $1 million, we bought that all property that's on the corner where the Higgins boat is, and the lots on either side of it. So that ended the controversy, and we moved the Eisenhower Center down right next to the museum right after that.
Mm-hmm. I guess there was another pretty big change around that time based on what some of the consultants were telling you. I mean, your idea, Steve's idea, was this is going to be primarily a repository for the various oral histories, some personal artifacts, but you kind of got a slap on the face around that time saying that, no, you needed to start collecting some major artifacts.
Well, yeah, we never dreamed we could be a collecting museum. This is very expensive to accept artifacts and care for them. So even when we moved downtown, the design of the architects was a small vault where we had some precious artifacts that related to the D-Day story, and we had a number of them. Many veterans who gave stories to Steve sent their knives or belts or helmets, and we were also collecting some people sent us artifacts from the Pacific as well. And And we bought a museum in St. Lo that was closing. We bought the whole thing lock, stock, and barrel with a lot of German stuff, but all came off the fields of Normandy and the Normandy invasion. And one of our board members paid for that. So we had a collection, but we didn't think it was going to be a never-ending process because we just thought we were not going to ever have that kind of money to support the collecting. But that changed as well, but we didn't change the size of our collection space. We had one curator the last 6 months before we opened, and that's up until then, we didn't have any staff. So it was a big strategic change.
Do you have a favorite artifact?
Well, that one is from, it's one of my favorites, Leo Scher, who is a corpsman, and he wrote me a letter saying that he was in a Higgins boat. He said, my Higgins boat blew up, and I had to swim to France. But he said, those bandage packs around there, they got all soaking wet on the way in, and they were not useless to him as a medic to help out. So he went to guys that were dead on the beach, and every soldier had one bandage pack there, and he took it off of dead men on the beach so he could start helping others who were wounded. But he said that he carried that web belt with all those bandage packs through the bulge and all the rest of the war, and every time he used one, he saw the face came to him of the dead soldier on Omaha Beach. And so he sent me the web belt. He said, you ought to have this. And when opening day, he was standing right next to it in his uniform. Leo Scher.
Amazing.
And then McElhenney, that's another one that's in the Pacific, first lieutenant in the 1st Marines in Guadalcanal, and he was at night surprised by Japanese, and the Japanese, they both couldn't see each other until they just ran into each other, and he pulled out his pistol, and the Jap was pulling out, he couldn't even get the saber out, so you could see that, and he slammed it down on McElhenney's head, knocked him unconscious, but McElhenney shot him, and they were both lying there on the ground. And his squad came up and they found him. They thought they were both dead. They put McElhenney and these artifacts on the stretcher. But McElhenney had just been knocked unconscious, and so when they got him back into the hospital tent, field tent, he came to. So, look, but that helmet has a dent in it right there where that saber comes down. So that's what we like is these personal, and Steve loved them, these personal artifacts that have a story to them, and they link up to the personal accounts of the veterans that we have. There is nothing more powerful than having the story and artifact, which is the tangible evidence of that memory. And that's been at the heart of this museum forever.
I knew you wouldn't be able to keep it to just one artifact.
I know.
So I guess another big surprise came in 1998 when you were just minding your own business, so walking to the museum office one day and you got ambushed, and they said, surprise, you're now going to be the chairman and CEO of the museum. That was a tough decision for you, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, it took me 5 or 6 months. I was on sabbatical at Steve's encouragement, and I entered the 5-year retirement plan for the University of New Orleans. And Steve and I had other plans just 2 months before this, and I was going back to teaching. I'd been kind of hijacked by administration and doing research parks and all the other things. And so Steve was there with General Livingston, the chairman, my predecessor, and my Chancellor O'Brien, and it was a cold day in January, and I was freezing. I couldn't figure out what they were doing standing out there on the cold. It was like 30 degrees, and the wind was blowing. It was a clear day. They grabbed me and said, Nick, we want you to be the next chairman. And that's Medal of Honor recipients from Vietnam. He's telling me that. Stephen grabs my hand and said, Nick, you got to do it. You got me into this. You got to get me out. Well, we were broke again, and so I was wondering there why none of these other business leaders wanted the job, because they had resources, they had friends. The reason we were broke again is because we weren't raising much private money. We had a little state money to renovate the warehouse. And then a chancellor says, Nick, I'll cut your load by 75% so you can work on this for the next 2 years and get this open. I said, huh, well, I was only teaching 2 courses, so I didn't know how I got 75%. He said, well, you'll teach 1 course. I said, oh, okay. So anyway, but I had to really think about it. And right before I decided, I got a letter from General Livingston. I was with Steve at the time up in Montana trying to think about the decision. And the election wasn't until September, so it was 9 months before the election when they asked me to be chairman. And at that time, there's still no staff except an administrative assistant. So a letter comes in and says, Steve, tell Nick he's got to decide soon because we're broke again. We can't make payroll. We can't pay contractors past the 1st of August. We got $170,000 left, and we need to know. So, and well, I did say yes. And I said I'd give it 2 years. But it was not it was a tough time for the board. I mean, and generally speaking, it had been 3 years since 1994, 5 years almost, 4 years, 5. So we were dead on arrival, basically. The board, a lot of board members were resigning. That's why they chose me. And the newspaper had been kind to us up until, I mean, in August, James Varney, who was a writer for the Times-Picayune, he wrote, at that time, since the high point in 1994, the museum quickly foundered like a Higgins boat strafed by Nazi gunners. But the museum's fortunes are brightening. Private Ryan and Ambrose deserve most of the credit. I mean, so that was the moment that before I took over as chairman. With the general told me you only got $1 million, Nick, to raise. And I said, well, we'll see what it is. It turned out to be about $12 million, but I had to do it in 2 years, and we had only raised $8 million in 8 years. So it was a tall order, but that was how I got into the saddle, and it was a pretty intense 2 years. Just had to give kind of body and soul to it, and but had a lot of people helping, and we had a lot of board members who weren't giving any money, and or getting any money, and I had no money to give. Steve was generous. He'd already given $750,000 from his book royalties. So he was there. He was steady. He was. If Steve had ever stepped down, and he was retired already from '96, but if he had not continued, I think it would have all fallen apart at that time. I mean, that was Steve. He promised me. He said if I took it on, and he said I'm staying with you through the end. So, but it was tough. So. That was a decision made, and the next 2 years were.
Right. Who were some of those unsung heroes, that key figures that kept the ball moving, so to speak? And there's also some others that were pretty well sung, pretty well known folks.
Yeah, well, we were a little bit lucky, despite all the depressing news about the financials at the time. Saving Private Ryan came out, and Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks wanted Ambrose to kind of bless the show, and he offered not only to bless it, but he thought it was the greatest war movie he'd ever seen, especially on World War II. And he said, "I'll do better than that. I'll come and I'll help you promote it, and we'll get veterans out in every city we go to." He said, I just got one thing to ask of you, that you guys show up at the grand opening and make a contribution. And they both did, and you can see them there on the screen 2 years later. And they didn't by any means solve all the problems. Governor Foster was one of the great heroes. And the Louisiana legislature, they put up $4 million to get rid of that loading dock and put up the Louisiana Memorial Pavilion in record time for state money, and I had to raise a lot of other private money. But Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg, they were committed to Steve Ambrose, to this museum, and Tom Hanks came to every grand opening to the last. This was an opening that anybody who was here in the city was present for. There were 200,000 people on the streets. We had 80 trucks with about 15 to 20 D-Day veterans, not just from Normandy, but from all over the Pacific and the Mediterranean. These crowds came spilled out of the office buildings, and all they said was, thank you, thank you. And it was emotional, just even thinking about it, looking at that picture. So that was the we did it moment. Yeah.
So just 2 years later, you lost Steve, and what did that mean for the museum? What did it mean to you personally? This is your best friend.
Well, before that, just to finish, there was a couple of shots up there.
Sure.
Governor Foster, Senator Stevens. Before we get to the funeral or services, go back to, if you can. Senator Stevens, General Livingston, Bob Livingston, who helped us, and there was another photograph there, I think, with Governor Foster, who got us the $4 million. So these are the champions. Steve is the #1 champion, of course. Governor Foster with the beard there. One meeting, I said I need $4 million, and that was in the fall of '98 to build the Louisiana Memorial Pavilion. And basically turned it over to his chief administrative officer, who said, we're going to do it. Jackie Clarkson was on our board, a representative. And I tell you what, it's the fastest building ever built by the state. So they were champions. There were so many. Look, this is if I had any skills at all, I think it's Ralph Crump, Merchant Marine guy, told me once, Nicky, you're the organizer. Well, it's maybe, I guess I have to confess to that, but it's organizing people, resources, and communicating and building relationships. And so that's what we did, and everybody was pulling together, and we had the best day of that opening day, June 6, 2000. So we'd made it. And then we had D-Days of the Pacific opening, because we had Senator Stevens and had already appropriated some money in Congress for that, and that was December 7 of 2001, and that was another big grand opening. Was not quite as spectacular as June 6, 2000, and that was about 8 months before Steve died, and so he was still in good shape there, but in October 13, 2002, he passed away. So that was a hard moment. Tom Brokaw immediately said, Nick, what are we going to do? And people came from all over. And that's his son speaking, Hugh, who was sort of helping with Steve's research. And so the board started asking, so I tried not to take offense. I said, what's Nick going to do without his pal? So Boise, who was chairman at that time, said, people are wondering, Nick, are you going to hang in there? I said, well, I got us this far. I said, with your all's help, I said, we're going to keep going. And we were in the middle of the master planning process, which you'll get to probably in a moment, but in any event,
Right.
it was really hard. It was shock of national, international news when Steve passed away. And of course, we knew he had cancer, and he learned that end of April, about 2002. So.
At the same time, and Steve was involved in this before he passed away, but there was this stunning development even before you opened up in 2000, where there was a decision that was made pretty boldly, pretty suddenly, to transform this into a D-Day museum into the National WWII Museum.
Yeah, well, that happened about 3 days before we had the grand opening on June 6th. Senator Stevens was in town, and he couldn't stand. He was a huge fan of Ambrose and had him up to his fishing camp in Alaska. He was the most powerful man in the Senate. He was the chair of Defense Appropriations and the Appropriations Committee, and Republicans were in the majority. And Danny Inouye, Medal of Honor recipient, Democratic, he was in the ranking. He was the two of them. He says, we always vote together. And it took me and Steve into my office after touring the D-Day exhibits and basically said, if you guys will do the rest of the war, because I was in the China, Burma, India theater, and Danny Inouye was in the Mediterranean, and this is D-Day, and it's the greatest museum on World War II in this country, and but it's not my war, and it's not Danny's war. But if you talk to your board, figure it out, take on the whole thing, I'll help. Steve was exhausted. Probably his health wasn't that good already. I didn't know it. But in any event, we said yes. And he did help. He got us $4 million a year for the next 3 years to buy all the land where that master plan is. And 4 years later, we had this master plan, a $282 million campus. And here's the warehouse across the street. When we announced that we were going to do the World War II Museum, you see another one of the Higgins boats, the one without the ramp, that we restored, poking out of that warehouse that's now gone, and it sits where the first building is, where the big theater is. So, yeah, so we're off onto a much bigger and larger mission, and well ahead of over our skis, I guess, again, because God, I mean, you thought we were crazy in 1990, but here we just had taken 10 years to raise $30 million, a little under, $25 million. And the museum was a roaring success from the day it opened. I mean, the visitors were just pouring in, but still, $282 million. We were really crazy, I guess. But Boise Bollinger was a great leader, great CEO, Bollinger Shipyards. He's sort of the icon of, and sort of the Andy Higgins of the last 40 years or 30 years. He always said, I'm more comfortable now that we can build a $282 million campus than I was that we'd ever open the museum when I came on the board in 1996. So I, at that time, had transitioned to president and CEO, and he had become chairman, and he was chairman for 4 years. And that was a big support to me, and Steve was encouraging right before he died to do the whole thing. And so we went to Washington with a big fanfare, and Tom Hanks agreed to be the honorary chair of the Capitol campaign, and Steve was gone, but we were riding high. It's another one of those Roman candles, though.
Right. I guess this brings us to summer of 2005, and of course, Hurricane Katrina hits, and that poses an existential threat to not only the city, of course, but also the museum.
Yeah. Well, as Mike Tyson says, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. We got a punch. I mean, here we really felt good right before this, but now there's nobody going to be in the city for a year. Nobody. The whole city was evacuated. So it was a gut check, and we went to Dallas to have a fly-in meeting, and I present 3 or 4 scenarios from crossing off everything that we were going to do and just go back to the D-Day Museum, or doing everything that we ever planned. I chose something in the middle to try to present it as cutting out some of the buildings and eliminating 55% of the staff. We only had 65 staff, so we're down to about 26. Just enough to, I said if they more than that, we would have had to go back to the D-Day plan. But in any event, that's, the board decided to support that. We had no income except the revenues that Stephen Watson was already starting to generate from our direct mail campaign and building our national membership up. So we went from 5,000 to 100,000 in a few years by that time, and that was going to kick in maybe 300,000-400,000. But we had to use the rainy day fund that we had put away. One of the board members said, "What if we have a real disaster? What are we going to do with that rainy day fund?" I said, "If this doesn't count, I don't know what does." So that's how we balanced the budget. We didn't actually have to use it, but so we just kept going. But it was hard. And Governor Pete Wilson became the chairman after that, and he used to deal with disasters out in California with earthquakes and things. So he was a great chairman. And David Velker, we had just great leadership. But that set us back, so we didn't open anything more till 2009. So,
I guess Katrina was kind of a wake-up call in another sense, where you had sort of a eureka moment where you realized that you were missing what should be a big part of the museum mission.
Oh yeah, I mean, I felt really stupid. I mean, I was vice chancellor at the University of New Orleans, and I was in charge of distance education. And so as soon as Katrina happened, I'm thinking, how do you fulfill your mission? You got nobody in your city. It's like you're living in the desert. The city's filled with water. Nobody's going to be coming to town for a couple of years. So distance education was something I'd been in charge of for the University of New Orleans, and set up regional campuses and TV courses. And I said, "Gee, why didn't I think of that?" So we kind of realigned our master plan at the time. I mean, it was always going to be focused on education. One of the buildings we cut out was a Center for the Study of the American Spirit, a library and a conference center, and there were some distance learning components in there, but nothing big. So now, together with the staff and Steve Watson and all of our senior staff and board, we decided we're going to make a major commitment to digitize everything in the museum. And that was the big, it was a $10 million commitment at a time it was increasing the capital campaign. So we're going to have to raise the money, but we got to do it. And that led to the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, our media center, a library, and education, and digitizing all of our collections and oral histories. And so it was a major investment. It was a big risk. But we did it, and the board stepped up at a very tough time. I mean, you're coming right after Katrina, 2 or 3 years, and deciding that's what we're going to do.
I wanted to talk a little bit about some of your ideas about how you wanted to communicate public history with this museum. So I guess you had some thoughts on that from the start. What was your vision for how you wanted to do that?
Well, it's pretty abstract, but foundationally, when you think about squeezing all of World War II into even the size of campus we do, and the choices you make, and what is that creative process? You are in a museum. It's about visual memory. It's creating environments. There's as much art and graphics and media and sound and oral histories, and all of it has to work together. So you're starting from ground zero. And in the preface of the book, history in a way is like art. It's concerned with the performance of factual content. The best history museums tell stories visually. In addition to historical records, they rely on art and design to move the audience to the heart of the historical experience, to make it personal, meaningful, and authentic. The National World War II Museum and this book aspire to the highest levels of that performance. So since the beginning of civilization, since the word, since writing, communications, everything's about performance, but now you have to do it in a compressed way, and you have to make that experience beyond all boundaries, beyond anything anybody can imagine until they come in and they want to say, I had no idea. And it has to just work seamlessly and in a profound way. And it's a challenge, and it took a lot of people. It took the Presidential Council. I brought the best World War II historians to the table, best museum leaders. And it said, help, let's figure this out. And so it took a lot of people, and we're fortunate to do it a building at a time, because we all learned as we went and as went along. And we had a goal, and I had a vision for where I wanted to take it. It was America's museum. We changed the mission to tell the story of the American experience in the war that changed the world. Why it was fought, how it was won, what it means today. So that all future generations will be inspired by what they learned here. That's a daunting responsibility to achieve that mission, and puts a lot of pressure on me and everybody on our staff and our exhibit designers and our counselors. So that's what we tried to do, and always the DNA of this museum has always been on the personal stories. That's where Stephen had the formative idea, and we never left that. That was determined, that was always going to be at the core of this sort of almost a ground-up story. You get the big story too, but it's the personal stories in those individual exhibits that really make this accessible experience. It's public history, it's public memory. It's not like reading a heavily footnoted manuscript.
You write about John Steinbeck, for example, some of the great war correspondents.
Yeah, I mean, we look at the war. I mean, we went to war with a segregated military. We incarcerated the Japanese Americans. We didn't do everything perfect. But in those exhibits, and the Liberation Pavilion too, we make people look at the war and see what the war correspondents, and Steinbeck was one of those. And I read it here, and he says in the New York Herald Tribune, he was in Italy, and he said, a small Italian girl in the street with her stomach blown out, an American soldier standing over a twitching body, crying and smelling the sharp cordite in the air and the hot reek of blood. And so his description is what we're trying to achieve in some elements of our exhibit. And you realize the war isn't just about strategy and tactics and generals, but how very fragile life is, and finding a balance between that big picture and what our veterans and soldiers and sailors and airmen experienced.
The title that you chose for this book, Preserving the Legacy, this is something I think probably comes to full expression in the final pavilion of the museum. What do you think the legacy is of World War II? What are the legacies that this museum tries to preserve?
Well, you just saw some images pass by you there that those, we want to remember the sacrifice. We want to remember what Eisenhower said to the troops and the media when he uncovered the atrocities in the first concentration camp, and he brought everybody in to document it so nobody could deny the Holocaust, the first encounter with it. And he said, Americans might wonder what we're fighting for, but now they're going to know what we're fighting against, which was fascism and racism in both Germany, Nazi Germany, and Japan. So that's part of the memory that we preserve here, especially in the Liberation Pavilion. And museums have a responsibility to try to convey what people remembered in World War II and after about the war, and what the meaning of that war was, and why they fought, and why we sacrificed more than 400,000 young boys to that conflict. And so the theme and the legacy, the principal theme, and the board and I and presidential counselors came to this together. Finally, they said it's about freedom. We were fighting to defend our freedom and our democracy. And it took, as Eisenhower said before D-Day, we're going to throw everything we have into this fight. And we did. And that is the public memory that we are preserving. And it was contested memories. So you look at those book covers. There's all kinds of literature that's been coming out in the last 20, 30 years about why we fight, moral combat, looks at the war between good and evil. Tom Brokaw talks about the greatest generation. Other people criticize that. We come down on the four freedoms that FDR proclaimed 9 months before the war in the State of the Union address. What Americans believed, we weren't even in the war yet. It wasn't Pearl Harbor until December 7. This was in January of 41. And he said, Americans believe in freedom of speech, and freedom of religion, and freedom from fear, and freedom from want. And at the end of each proclamation of our beliefs and values, said, for all peoples of the world, these values are good for all peoples. He's setting a framework and a vision for what America will do after the war in the peace, when we begin to advance freedom and democracy and human rights. Yes, as an ideological counterpart to communism and to fascism. We didn't have that kind of a dictatorial foundation for American ideals. Freedom. And we felt, and he felt, that freedom and allies and democracies, and more democracies in the world, the more we are going to have allies who will defend against the age-old struggle between authoritarianism and totalitarian dictatorships. Freedom and democracies are the enemies of totalitarian, communist, or fascist regimes. They always will be. This is nothing new. It was true in the American Revolution. Why do you think we rebelled against King George III? What did they do in the French Revolution? Inspired by us. So the sacrifice that we experienced and had to grieve over was really about those who had died so that we can be free. And if you don't think America believed that what we were fighting for, the Norman Rockwell posters of those four freedoms were in almost every home in America. And 16 million of these victory medals were given to every single veteran. And what does it say on the back? You can see it. Freedom from fear and want, freedom of speech and religion. So this is the public memory of the war that we have documented and what came out of that. The Declaration of Human Rights, advances throughout the world of alliances, NATO, civil rights, women's rights were advanced, great advances in technology because of the GI Bill and the science and technology that was stimulated by National Defense Education grants, a great explosion of higher education as these 16 million veterans came back and went into universities. And so the 80 years, I think, that we document in the Liberation Pavilion, really, I think, is a documentation of that theme of freedom, whether Republican or Democrat, through 80 years. It kept us out of World War III. And I think Steve Ambrose would say, created America as the richest and freest nation in the world. And this museum is a love song to democracy. So if you believe that, raise your hands.
Thank you, Nick and Steve. Questions, please raise your hands. We'll bring the microphones to you. Connie's going to start. Center aisle, about halfway back, gentlemen.
Nick, in the Pacific Pavilion, there is a photo of a young Marine. It's flag-covered remains on a stretcher, and at the end of the stretcher is his father, Colonel Fenton, praying over his son, Thomas Fenton. Thomas Fenton was a graduate of my high school in Baltimore.
Wow.
Thank you very much for preserving his memory.
Wow, thank you.
Next question's going to be in the front row with Deborah.
Thank you, Nick. That was really, really exciting. But I would imagine there's many of us here who've been coming to these conferences for 18 years. Would you give us some insight of how y'all get it started and how you come up with the different topics every year and stuff?
Well, the master planning process in 2000, after Senator Stevens kind of gave us the mandate to go forward and figure it out, and the money to figure it out with, that was important. We brought in Lord Cultural Resources, and I brought in a charrette of top historians. Don Mueller was there. Steve Ambrose made it to one meeting. And had about 12 of us, even one of the Disney Imagineers who were great at creating experiences. And we hammered this out for 18 months, and tried to figure out what to keep, what not to do, what the story was going to be about. This museum is about the story. The story is king here. So whether from the ground up or even the generals or whatever. And so we finally put it together. But then we had that whole master plan that was based on all that work that you saw, that beautiful first rendering. And as you can see, we stuck to that master plan for all those 23 years. I retired in 2017, and Stephen, as you saw him with a veteran there, Watson, he finished off the Liberation Pavilion. And that was the last pavilion that I told you earlier, that the exhibit designer said, after we thought we finished everything about the war, we were in 1945, and then he said, so what? So what? You got to 45. Why does it make a difference to anybody that you have done this museum about World War II. That led us to another couple of months working on liberation. And the board, as those of you board members here know, that we had to reinvent liberation several times during about 8 years later, because we were tired, and so my initial idea was, well, we'll just do liberation about what it meant to America in terms of technology and science and medicine and space and Marshall Plan, international, GI Bill, and then 10 years later, I'm thinking, we were a superpower. This is a global power. So the meaning for America is no longer just about what happens in America anymore. It's America's footprint and presence in the world as a champion of freedom and democracy everywhere. And so we have to find a way to tell that story thematically. So it was an evolving thing as each pavilion came out of the ground and the exhibits within it, and we had to go back to the presidential councils and engage the board. I want to tell you, this board looked at every concept plan that we had, and I wanted them to. I wanted them to own the exhibits, the plan, the stories that we were going to tell. And boy, they got into it, and we had some controversies along the way too. So anyway, that's how we did it. I don't know. I mean, I wrote, it's all in the book. Read the book.
And Nick, to Deborah's other part of the question, how did the conference start? I think it was a bunch of historians drinking again.
Yeah, that was Don Miller and I were before Katrina, right after the big kickoff of the World War II expansion in Washington. I went up to Easton, Pennsylvania, and we went to see Lou Rita, the filmmaker. We were sitting on the floor and brainstorming about different things. And we didn't know Katrina was going to knock us in the ditch. So we started thinking like Amherst, and that's one of the ways we kept things going in the 90s. We had conferences, and Steve was putting out books with the Eisenhower Center. Let's do the best and biggest conference that we can do. We get the best historians. We'll have controversies. We'll have everybody excited. We'll get veterans in there. And Don says, that's a great idea. Let's do it. And so we started talking about Rick Atkinson, Max Hastings, Victor Davis Hanson, and Medal of Honor recipients. And we started calling people. We had probably 20 speakers lined up by the end of the day. And so we had a plan for 2005 and then Katrina, and so we moved to 2006. And if anybody was there, I mean, we had the World of History, which are all the historians in the Louisiana Pavilion, and next door we had, in the Contemporary Art Center, we had a connecting door, World of Memory. We had Japanese veterans, we had German veterans, we had American veterans. I mean, and you can still get a DVD of that at the museum, the whole collection. It's the only time we ever created a DVD. It was so exciting, and you could have shot a cannon through the museum because there's nobody in town. We had no visitors at that point, and that place was steaming and packed. People were going back and forth, and Governor Wilson came up to me and said, Nick, never do this again. We can't decide which session to go into. You can't have concurrent sessions that are this great. He says, just one session. I said, well, we'd have been here all week if we'd had just one session. So, but it was exciting, and the exciting thing about it is that it was bringing the museum back to life after Katrina with education. And the education that this museum and the exhibits tried to do had to inspire people to go forward and to continue to help us. And so we built our community wider. But education was a major milestone because it's all we could do. We didn't have any visitors. And then the next week, there was nobody in the museum again. But you know, education, and Pete Crane mentioned it at the end, and that's part of the ongoing strategic plan because Stephen Watson and the senior staff, after I'd continued that commitment. And my belief that the purpose of learning is to free people. And an independent, free country is the only place that can happen, democracy. So learning empowers people, it frees people, and that's what we want to have happen in our exhibits, and we want it to happen here with all of you every time you come here, back here. So many of you have been here again and again, 8, 10 times. This is the 18th, I think, isn't it? 18th conference. Some of my professional friends in the history department up there said, I've never seen anybody more than 50 people come to a program on World War II downtown back in the 80s and 90s. More than 50. And if you're going to charge them, you'll never get anybody there. And now you all are part of this future of this museum. It's your museum. It's not my museum. It's not Steve's museum, Steve Ambrose's. It's your museum. You're all part of who carry this torch forward by your presence here and your loyalty to this institution.
We have a question to your left with Connie, please.
In the early days of your museum planning, there was a pretty major push to get a national memorial, World War II memorial in D.C. Did that in any way indirectly compete with your fundraising efforts, or in other words, cause any confusion about where to give?
There was a little bit of confusion at the beginning, but Steve was on the committee in Washington to decide on the architecture. I always felt, and Steve did too, that monuments are a place you go to remember. Museums are a place where you go to remember and to learn. So monuments have their role, and they convey certain pieces of memory about how you present that monument. And Keith Lowe, who's speaking at the conference, is one of the great historians on memory and monuments and museums. And so I don't think there's any conflict. There was some tension between some of the people we were trying to raise money from and people who were giving, including Tom Hanks, who was giving money to the memorial. And it opened in, I want to say, 2004. Is that right? So a few years after we did. But there was never any conflict. I thought it was, and 34 years ago when Steve had this, or 35 when Steve had the idea to do this, he said, it's because Congress is not interested in doing anything about World War II because the World War II veterans don't want it, don't demand it. They don't want to talk about it. We all have stories of how they did not want to talk about it. I mean, some because of the traumatic, some because their wives and friends wouldn't understand what they went through. And this museum gives them permission to talk about it, I think, in their later years. And so Steve just said, screw them in Washington. They're never going to do it up there. They tell me they're never going to do a museum. They weren't even going to do a monument then. And so he just said, hell with them. Andy Higgins was here. We're here. We got these oral histories. We got a historic site. We're not at that historic site, but that's how it started. And so you start one way and kind of take a left turn and you're downtown.
Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Vogel and Dr. Nick Mueller.
All right, some quick housekeeping before everyone leaves. Otherwise, you're going to ask me the same questions that I'm about to announce. Thank you for everybody here today, our audience, our speakers. Yesterday, we had 9,000 people online. So thanks to the people online as well. Open house across the street in the museum, Nick's museum, as just described, from 5:30 to 7:30 this evening. So soon after this, go over there. There's hors d'oeuvres and drinks in Louisiana Memorial Pavilion. There's musical entertainment by the museum's Victory Band. There will be 2 screenings of the newly refreshed Beyond All Boundaries, one at 6 p.m. and one at 7 p.m. Those are first come, first served. You can enter through the Louisiana Memorial Pavilion, the main entrance, or you can enter through the firehouse, the red doors on Magazine Street. Speakers, we'll meet in the Patriot Circle Lounge downstairs by 6 p.m. tonight. I said it. Breakfast tomorrow morning, 6:30 a.m. right here on the terrace, and our first session will begin tomorrow at 8:45. Thank you to all of you. Thanks to our speakers, the great ideas, and Godspeed this evening.
And take your stuff with you because we will bust the tables tonight. Thank you.